Brenda Miller from the ABQ Sewing Studio in Strathroy, Ontario, and I am also the designer from the pattern line called Among Brenda's Quilts. And I have just developed a new pattern for a very easy to make placemat. Actually, there's two options, and they're called the So Simple Picture Perfect Placemats. And here's one of them. And in this pattern, I talk about binding from the back or from the front, and using either a finishing method using hand stitching or a finishing method using a quilt binding foot to do the binding entirely by machine. If you like this video, please follow me and hit the subscribe button. I'd love to have you in our group. To begin this process, you're going to want to have a few things. You will need a placemat, of course, to work with. You will want to have a stiletto to hold things down as you stitch. You'll need your binding, and in this case I have made binding that is 2.5 inches wide, and folded it in half and pressed it. And you will require a quilt binding foot. I'm using a Baby Lock crescendo machine, and Baby Lock has a quilt binding foot. It is QBF is the number. Now, if you've never seen a quilt binding foot before, I'll just show you what it looks like. So it's a fairly rectangular large foot, and it has a ridged area on one side. So one side has a thicker metal than the other, and that helps you guide the foot along the folded edge of the binding. The first step is to sew the binding to the actual placemat, and when we are using the quilt binding foot to stitch down the front, and I'll just show you what that looks like here. There's an example of it stitched down. We want to first attach the binding to the back of the placemat. Alright, next we want to find the center of the bottom edge, but along the back here. So we're going to fold in half, put our placemat in half, and place a pin. It's kind of bunchy. There, okay, and then we're going to take our binding, which has been folded in half, wrong sides together, and we're going to place it 1 inch beyond the pin, and then we'll just use that same pin to pin it in place. Okay, next we're going to go to our sewing machine, and with our just regular sewing foot on and a 1/4 inch seam, we're going to start sewing just maybe 1 inch or 2 on the other side of the pin to get to the corner. So I'll show you that next. Okay, so we are starting our stitching. And we are going to sew towards our first corner. And what I like to do, especially with beginners, is ask them to place a pin 1/4 inch from that corner. Right about there. You can see that. So that they know where to stop stitching. Okay, so that's about 1/4 inch away. So I'll stitch to that spot. And I may need to just work a bit of fullness in there. You could use your walking foot as well if you like. Okay, I'm approaching my pin, and now I'm going to backstitch. And I can cut my thread here and start on the other side. But a little trick so you don't have a lot of tail ends in your corners is to just lift your needle and lift your foot and turn the whole thing around. Okay, so now I'm going to remove my pin, and I'm going to pull my binding back into the corner, kind of like making a bed. So there's a 45-degree angle here, and then I'm going to pull it back. So that all edges are square. And I can start sewing again. And if you find that your machine isn't moving ahead very well, just grab what's called a Gina-majig, or put a little piece of cardboard behind it so it lifts the foot up. Okay, now I'm headed for the next corner, and again I want to put a pin a 1/4 of an inch away from that corner, so I know where to stop. This time I'm going to cut the threads, in case you like to do it that way. Okay, so I'm coming up to my pin, I backstitch, and I cut my thread. And then we take our binding and pull it straight back so that it is even with the new edge. There's a 45-degree angle here in the corner. Hoping you can see that. Maybe I'll just tilt up a bit. There. Okay. And then we'll bring back our binding so that it's even with the corner. And you could put a pin in here to hold it all together if you want. So that's what you should be seeing. So once again, I pulled it back at a 45-degree angle, and so that the edges, the raw edges, are even. And then I folded it back towards the new side, keeping that corner square. Okay, and then I will begin stitching here, and I'll use my little Gina-majig again to lift the back of my foot. Sewing feet do not like to sew uphill. Okay, and then off we go again. Okay, now I'm coming towards the area where we started, and what I want to do is I want to trim my binding so that it overlaps by about 2 inches. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in on itself by about 1 inch. And I am going to pin that folded area in place and lay my little tail end inside of that fold, and then tuck it in, sandwiching it in the binding. Try and keep everything nice and square. My pinning job is a little off square, so I'll just fix that. Lay my beginning end in there, sandwich my tail end, and pin it all together. Okay, now I can proceed with my stitching. If you get to the point where it's a little bit lumpy, just straighten it out. There we go. And then I'm going to overstitch the area where I started and cut my thread. Okay, so we've got that all tucked in. And now it is time to turn the whole piece over and show you how to use the quilt binding foot to fasten it all together. But actually, before I do that, I'm going to take my little scissors here and just trim out a little bit of the corners. And I can also snip off any little dog ears that I might have that will contribute to bulk. So, corners, and then I'm gonna turn it and we'll stitch down from the front. All right, so I have got a thread to match my binding on the top, and I have a thread to match my backing in the bobbin. Okay, and you'll need to do that as well. Then I have my stiletto handy, and I kind of like one little clip to help me get started, and I'll pull my binding over, just clip it, and then my quilt binding foot, when I bring it down, is going to rest so that this edge kind of butts up to the folded edge of the binding. All right. Now I'm going to begin stitching, and I'm going to hold everything down. Oop, just put my foot here, I cannot hardly reach. 1 second. All right, and it's a good idea just to tuck in any loose threads in the binding so you don't have to trim them off. And then you begin your stitching. Holding everything down with your stiletto. And if you find it's just folding back on you a little bit, raise your foot and just drop it again and it'll sort itself out. All right. Now we're coming up to a corner, and I'll just pull that binding flat, and then I'll just fold it back over the stiletto. And I will use the stiletto to just hold that corner in place. Now when we come up to the corner, your foot might kind of pull your binding back, so you might have to lift your foot just to get it to sort itself out. So I'm in the corner, and I've just stitched a stitch into the next side just to hold everything down. And now I'm going to pivot. Still got that stiletto handy to hold everything in place. This is a great way to do things you want done in a hurry. Placemats, of course, get a lot of washing, so you want to make sure they're securely stitched down. Fold my next corner. I use this on quilts as well, and I use invisible thread at the top so that you can't really even see the stitching unless you look very closely. Okay. I use my stiletto to kind of fold back that corner. I have a metal stiletto here. The plastic is just not gonna work as well because the metal can kind of pierce the fabric a little bit. All right, now I'm going to, and when you use the stiletto, you don't want to hold the stitching back. You just want to hold the fabric in place. So you don't want to like poke into your machine so that your feed dogs can't move. It's starting to curl a little here, so I'll just lift my foot and drop it again. The idea is just to keep it in place. This will be our last corner. There. That stiletto point is just like a pin to hold things down. Okay. This is the beginning point, so I'm just going to tuck in that little bit of fullness. Poke it down. Okay, now I have to lift my foot because it's catching. We just want to make sure that that little bit is under the foot. Okay. We're over the hump. And we'll just overstitch a little bit where we began and backstitch. So there it is. I think it's looking pretty nice, and that was quickly accomplished. So when I'm doing a placemat, a bunch of them, the pattern works on 4 at a time. I will do the sewing at the back first for all of them, and then I will, work on the front. So that's how to use the stitch a binding foot, the quilt binding foot, and I think it does a terrific job. Quite nice. When you're working on a binding that is hand sewn to the back, you're going to follow basically the same beginning procedure by folding your placemat in half at the bottom edge and placing your raw edges even with that 1-inch overlap beyond the pin. And then you're going to go ahead and stitch the binding to the front just like we did for the back. And then when you turn it over to the back, you're going to use your favorite hand stitching method. And that will finish off your beautiful placemat. So I hope you investigate that new pattern called the So Simple Picture Perfect Placemats. And there are 2 to choose from. The first style is called the Scenic Placemat. And that's this one. And the second one is the Pineapple Vista placemat. And just to point out to you, the Pineapple Vista, we're using an all-over directional print here by Northcott, and it's their Naturescape Still Water collection. And in the Scenic Placemat, we've actually used their border print from that same collection. It has 6.5-inch wide stripes, which works perfectly for this scenic look. So visit my site. You can shop online at shop.amongbrendasquilts.com, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe at the bottom. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.